the steady rhythm of oars, and the glint of morning light on seawater, a long, sleek Viking ship emerges from the mist. In 787, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the first arrival of 3 ships on English shores, an event so unprecedented that the local official who rode out to meet them knew not what they were. And when he did meet them, he was promptly slain. A few years later, in 793, the same chronicle tells of heathen men ravaging the holy island of Lindisfarne, presaged by fiery dragons seen in the sky. These dragons, they were both an omen and a metaphor, and it reflects how closely Viking longboats were associated with dread. Yet beyond the fear they instilled in their distant victims, the ships were a source of pride for their makers, innovation, and even identity. They were vehicles of not only war but trade, instruments of exploration and colonization, and of course potent symbols woven into myths and sagas. So let's learn all about Viking longboats today. That's an interesting topic. There's a lot of little details and eccentricities that you might not know. So over the next hour, I think you're going to learn quite a lot about them. But let me welcome you to the channel first. If you're new here, I invite you to click that subscribe button and leave your thoughts in the comments. Also, we are 100% ad-free on this channel, and quite proudly so. But we are only able to do this because of the generous support on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the occasional donation, and those who decided to check out the merch store. So thank you so much for anybody choosing to check out those avenues. Now, without further ado, let's begin this very long video. Well, let's start by saying that Viking longboats certainly did not emerge in a vacuum, but rather were the product of a long-standing Scandinavian boat-building tradition, one refined over hundreds of years. In fact, archaeological finds reveal that by the early Viking Age, that is the 8th century, the dates that we have already mentioned, the Lindisfarne range and so on, Norse shipwrights had already mastered a distinctive construction technique. This is known as clinker building. Let me explain. In clinker-built ships, the hull is formed from long oak planks that actually overlap one another like the scales of a fish, fastened with tens of thousands of iron rivets. This method produced a hull that was both strong and flexible, able to twist and flex in heavy seas, rather than shatter like other boats would. Contemporary descriptions emphasize the elegant symmetry and lightness of the vessels. They were slender and flexible, with symmetrical ends and a true keel. Ultimately, crafted for speed, the ends of the ship rose in graceful curves, often terminating in upturned prows. And some of those prows may have been carved with animal heads, hence the terms like dreki or dragon ship in later sagas, though this detail is known mainly from later literary sources. But what we can know for certain is that by the Viking Age, these ships featured a sturdy keel running along the base for stability, and a mast to carry a sizable woolen sail, another crucial innovation that, combined with oars, gave the longboat its famous versatility. Now, in terms of structure, a typical Viking longboat had a long and narrow hull, with a ratio of length of around 6:1 or greater, and that enabled it to cut swiftly through water. A well-preserved example is the Gutenburg ship, a 9th century vessel excavated from a burial mound in Norway. It's about 22 meters in length, and 5 meters wide, and the elegant lines and carvings demonstrate the craftsmanship of a Viking shipwright. Its shallow draft, only about a meter, by the way, meant it could navigate waters that were mere shallows and even land directly on beaches, a feature that astonished those accustomed to deep-keel ships of the south. The Anglo-Saxon monk Alcuin, writing after the Lindisfarne raid, marveled at how the Viking ships could suddenly appear, quote, and sail back on the sea like phantoms, another testament to their speed and the Norse advantage of mobility. It was the light weight that meant that they could even be carried over portages when necessary. That's right, just taken out of the water and carried over. It's hard to imagine that with a ship, but that's what they were doing. Not the first instance of this, certainly not the last. Well, this portability also allowed Vikings to drag ships over land between rivers or even around fortifications, literally bringing their navy across continents. The basic design of the longboat was time-tested. It drew from earlier Germanic vessels, for instance the 4th century Nydam boat found in present-day Denmark. It shows many features that Vikings would later perfect. Except for one thing, the Nydam boat lacked a sail. By the 8th century, sails had been adopted pretty much universally, greatly extending the range of Scandinavian ships. With a single square sail of wool, sometimes up to 100 square meters on larger ships, mounted on a mast amidships, a Viking longboat could harness the North Atlantic winds. But when the wind failed, or precision maneuvering was needed, crews would take up the oars. Oar ports along the gunwales or the sides of the boat indicate typical crews of anywhere from a dozen rowers on smaller boats to 30 or more on the bigger ones. For example, let's take the Gutenburg ship that we've mentioned. It has 15 oar ports on each side for 30 rowers in total. And saga sources speak of even larger ships. Now every detail of the design balanced speed, agility, and seaworthiness. The longboat's hull, wide amidships, and tapering to pointed bow and stern, gave it stability in rough seas while preserving a shallow draft. Its double-ended shape, symmetrical bow and stern, meant it could reverse direction easily without having to turn around. A handy trait for quick beach landings and, of course, retreats. Even the steering oar, that being the rudder in naval terminology, and yes, I'll try to do my best with the naval terminology and explain everything. The steering oar was innovatively mounted on the starboard, that being the right side, on a pivot, and that would allow the helmsman to take fine control and make these fine movements. But the Vikings were also not prone to writing treatises about their ships, but later medieval saga writers convey a sense of universal admiration for the design. No matter what happened and all of the wars, they certainly had to admit that they had pretty good boats. One saga writer explains that a true king's ship could be the finest blend of form and function, long and slender as a serpent, yet strong-timbered and high-sided. And indeed, the very term longship, that is langskip in Old Norse, by the way, came to denote these war cruisers par excellence, in contrast to broader cargo ships. Still, the underlying design principles, clinker hull, keel, shallow draft, single mast with a square sail, they were common across different types of Viking vessels. It was a modular design that shipbuilders could scale up or down as needed, producing boats fit for fishing and local ferrying, all the way to grand royal longboats that could carry hundreds of warriors. But building a Viking longboat, that was pretty difficult. In fact, it was a community endeavor, not to mention an act of expert craftsmanship. It's not just like smacking together a small raft or barge to go down the river. Norse shipbuilders, often working near wooded shores or fjords, knew how to extract the best work from their materials. Quite ahead of their time, actually. Now, in terms of the wood of choice, that was oak. For the hull, mainly. It was tough, rot-resistant, and pretty abundant in Scandinavia. Shipwrights would fell tall, straight oaks and split them lengthwise to create the strakes or planks for the hull. Using the natural curve of the tree branches, they fashioned ribs and frames that would support the planking. The construction was done hull first. Builders laid the keel, and then raised the stem and stern posts, and then attached plank after plank, each overlapping the last in that clinker style. As one plank was secured to the next with iron rivets, the ship slowly took shape like a giant wooden shell. It was only after the hull was complete that the internal frames and crossbeams would be fitted, a technique that produced a very fair hull shape and allowed for a bit of flexibility, which is very important when you're being thrashed about in the sea. Rivers not so bad, but the sea between, well, up near the North Sea, between that passage of Scandinavia and England, that can be quite a bumpy ride. Contemporary accounts from the sagas give a vivid sense of the labor involved. For example, in Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, the saga of Olag Tryggvason, we read of how King Olaf commissioned the greatest longship of his time. Many hands were put to work, and quote from the text, some to fell wood, some to shape it, some to make nails, some to carry timber, and all that was used was of the best. And yeah, this matches what archaeology suggests. That building a longboat was a highly organized process. Skilled craftsmen called shipsmiths oversaw the shaping of each plank, so it would fit snugly along to its neighbor. Iron rivets, referred to as nails in the saga, though they were actually clenched rivets with a row of plate, were forged in quantity. The Heimskringla account even describes an incident where the master builder, displeased with the shape of the hull, secretly went along one side of the unfinished ship and carved a series of notches. The next day the workers were horrified to find the hull seemingly ruined, but the builder calmly shaved down the planks to remove the notches, thereby fairing the hull to a more graceful form. I mean, he could have just told them, but well, that wouldn't make for a very good story, wouldn't it? This is why, as well, a lot of these stories from sagas and everything, sometimes you can't take them exactly as a historical fact. You can take them more as a parable, a kind of moral story, this kind of thing. Not dismissing it, just adding that little pinch of salt that we need with these sorts of things. Anyway, King Olaf and his men concluded that the ship was a lot better looking for this adjustment, showing the artistry involved in achieving an optimal hull shape. Now, the raw materials required to build a large longship, they were quite considerable in themselves. One reconstruction, the Sea Stallion of Glendalough, that is a modern replica of a 30-meter Viking warship, illuminates this scale. You see, the builders roughly needed 150 cubic meters of wood, primarily fresh oak for planking and naturally curved oak limbs for the frames. Approximately 400 kilograms of iron were required to forge the rivets and bolts holding the ship together. Kilograms, of course. 1 kilogram is like 2 pounds, so think about 800 pounds of iron. And then around 3,000 meters of hemp rope were made for the rigging. everything from the thick stay that held the mast to halyards, sheets for the sail, and mooring lines. Now, as for the sail itself, it was woven from wool, and it could be 100 square meters in area for a big warship. Producing such a sail, of course, is a massive task, usually involving the Viking Age women experts in spinning and weaving. A single sail might consume the wool of hundreds of sheep and require several man-years of labor to produce by hand. All these materials were assembled using simple tools, axes, draw knives, augers. Yet the precision achieved is evidenced by the ships that we do have surviving. The planks of the Gokstad and Oseberg ships, for example, they're so finely jointed that even after 1,000 years in the earth, the hulls held together when excavated. Now, if that's not built to last, I don't know what is. But it is important to note that Viking shipwrights built without detailed blueprints, at least as we know them. Knowledge was rather passed down orally and through apprenticeship. The proportions were likely laid out by eye and experience alone, perhaps guided by simple measuring rods or templates for curves. In the sagas, exceptional builders were admired almost like sorcerers of their time. Their craft seemed to be magical, but underlying their skill was a deep empirical understanding of wood's properties and the sea's demands. They shaped each plank to meet the next at just the right angle, forming a watertight lap joint sealed with tarred animal hair or moss. They drove rivets through the pre-drilled holes and pinned them over iron roves, that is, washers, to clinch the planks tight. They then fashioned sturdy oak ribs and beams to brace the hull interior, yet often left the hull planking itself as the main strength, a kind of natural monocoque design that could flex in the waves. Got to have a bit of give, that's for sure. This is also a technique that they use in making housing and buildings in general a little bit more earthquake-proof. If we look at the Japanese building traditions, especially the pagodas and all the rest, there's no actual nails in them. Rather, everything fits together in a way that it can slide around and react to any external disturbances. A little bit different from the Viking tradition, of course, but it's just another example of having this necessary movement within building and construction, whether that be stationary structures or boats or anything else. Well, anyway, when all the woodwork was done, the longboat would be finished with more practical details. A steering oar mounted on the starboard side towards the stern, rowers' benches or thwarts, which were often removable, by the way, and sometimes decking at bow and stern to serve as fighting platforms or cargo space. The hull was typically coated with a mixture of pine tar and oil to make it waterproof, giving the ships a dark, glossy finish, and also a distinctive, resiny smell. Some ships may have featured colorful painted shields hung over the gunwales when going into battle. One image made iconic by the later artwork in the Bayeux Tapestry, which, though depicting 11th century Normans, does show similar ships. Normans, of course, being descendants of Vikings. Yes. Now, the result of this building process was a longboat that could be both lightweight and incredibly durable. For example, the Gokstad ship, which is from around 890 and found in Norway, had a keel plank nearly 18 meters long and a broad, sturdy hull. Tests with replicas showed that such a ship could endure oceanic voyages and even surf down large waves. The Gokstad's builders inserted removable oar plugs so the oar ports could be closed at sea, and that prevented water ingress. A small design element, but a very crucial one. And indeed, many such clever touches appear in Viking longships, and this proves that they were not crude barbarian crafts, but rather very sophisticated vessels honed for performance. It was science. You don't think of the Vikings doing science, but what else would you call this? It's pure science, practical, for the purpose and for the time. But in economic terms, a large longship was an expensive investment. It certainly did not come cheap. It required contributions of iron, which in the Viking Age meant laborious smelting of bog iron ore, and skilled labor over many months. Kings and earls sponsored shipbuilding, and laws in some Scandinavian kingdoms stipulated that communities must collectively outfit ships for defense. Thus, the longboat was a communal achievement. When a new ship was launched, it represented the manpower, material, and ambition of an entire village or clan. So you can imagine the scene. After those years of weaving that sail, all those months of getting the wood and the iron and everything, certainly imagine on that maiden voyage, the whole village coming out to wave as the warriors go off to war. Maybe to their doom. Who knows? But the important part is they go together on that ship that everybody built. Now I'm sure you've got an image in your head. One from the images you've already seen, and two from what we've just discussed over the last 20 minutes. But not all Viking ships were the same. It's just like how the modern navy has specialized vessels. The Norsemen had different ship types, some optimized for war, some for trade, and other purposes. But broadly, Viking ships can be divided into two categories in the literature side of things, that is, warships, often called longships, and merchant vessels. However, this is a bit of a simplification. There is a bit of an overlap. A sturdy cargo ship might join a war fleet, and a warship certainly carried trade goods or settlers at times. Nevertheless, understanding the ideal types helps us shed a bit of light on the Viking naval capabilities. So let's start with the warships. These are the iconic Viking raiding vessels. Long, narrow, fast. The Norse called them various names. Snake, swift cutter, drekki or dragon, if they were adorned with a dragon-head prow, which of course would be quite threatening to see come out in the early morning. A typical war longship, like a snekja or a snake, might be around 17 to 20 meters long, and carrying perhaps 20 pairs of oars, even 40 rowers, and additional crew. It had a sleek profile and a shallow draft, enabling quick movement in coastal or rivers. Sagas and chronicles highlight the speed and movement and striking power of these ships. For example, the annals of St. Bertin record that in 845 a Viking force of 120 ships sailed up the Seine River to besiege none other than Paris. The Frankish chronicler marvels at how swiftly they moved and how unstoppable they seemed to be on the river. Warships were light enough that their crews could drag them onto a beach or even across a strip of land to bypass defenses. This was not just theoretical. In Eastern Europe, the Norse Rus adventurers reportedly portaged their longboats between river systems to reach the Black Sea. The primary chronicle of the Eastern Slavs, not cited here but well known, describes Viking Rus hauling their boats around rapids on the Dnieper. At the high end of warship design were the great ships of kings. They were longer, and of course carried quite a few more men, The most famous is perhaps Olag Tryggvason's longship, the Ormur in Langi, or Long Serpent. According to Snorri's account, which we have mentioned, that saga, the Long Serpent had 34 rowing benches, and that implies 68 oarsmen, plus additional crew, easily over 100 men in total. It was said to be 43 meters in length, and lavishly decorated with gilded dragon heads and tails. While saga figures might be exaggerated, archaeological evidence confirms Vikings did build some very large warships, especially by the late Viking Age. The discovery of the Roskilde 6 longship in Denmark, which is dated to around 1025, revealed a vessel about 37 meters long, a true leviathan of its day. These great warships, sometimes called drekar, were prestige objects intended for the retinues of kings. They could outpace smaller ships and overwhelm by sheer capacity. Saxo Grammaticus, in the Gesta Danorum, even mentions legendary fleets of 150 ships and a fantastical armada of 3,000 vessels under King Canute. But hold your horses, these are likely exaggerations, and probably wildly exaggerated. But they are indicative of the psychological impact of a Viking navy. What unified the warship class was their emphasis on speed and maneuverability over cargo space. Their hulls were narrower, and beams were relatively slim. They often had higher freeboard than merchant ships, that is, side height, by the way, to allow fighting from the decks and to handle the rough waters. But they ultimately remained open boats, without full decks. Warriors in battle would station themselves along the gunwales, sometimes lashing ships together to create a stable fighting platform, as described in accounts of naval battles. One example of that, by the way, is the Battle of Svolder around year 1000, where Olav Tryggvason's ships were tied together to resist boarding. It's tactics like that show the Viking warships were effectively extensions of land armies onto water. Long, stable platforms for hand-to-hand combat, yet quite capable of swift movement and rapid retreats when needed. So let's talk about the merchant ships. Slightly less exciting than the warships. But don't worry, they've got some eccentricities of their own. Now, they were called knarr, and that's spelled Knarr. In contrast to the lean warships, the Viking merchant vessels, also known as kaupskip or buying ship, were built for capacity and open ocean sailing. A knarr was typically shorter and much broader in beam, and we do have one well-studied example, Skjoldelev I, a wreck found in Roskilde Fjord in Denmark. It's about 16 meters long and nearly 5 meters wide. With its deep hull, it could carry up to 24 tons of cargo, far more than a longship could. The hull of a knarr was fuller and deeper, giving it a draft of around 1.5 meter when loaded. This greater depth and a shorter length made it slower under oar, and indeed knarrs had few oar positions, often just for harbor maneuvering, but they were optimized for sailing on the high seas. A single large square sail propelled these ships in their hull form and allowed them to ride out the ocean waves with heavy loads. I suppose you could say the knarrs were the workhorses of Viking trade and colonization. They're the kinds of ships that would have carried timber, furs, iron, wool, all the other trade goods that were needed. And they would carry them from Scandinavia to ports as far as the British Isles, the Baltic, and Francia. One historical account from the late 9th century describes a Norwegian trader, Othere, who sailed his cargo ship from Norway around England, and even up to the White Sea in the Arctic. Journeys only feasible in a stout sailing knarr. The longships were tough, but not quite built for that purpose. Now these ships, the knarrs, were also likely the ones used to transport families and livestock to new settlements. The sagas of the Norse settlement of Iceland and Greenland, such as the saga of Eric the Red, describe how groups of settlers loaded their belongings, livestock, and kin into the great knarr. And indeed, knarrs routinely crossed the North Atlantic, ferrying sheep, cattle, and horses to Greenland, returning with walrus ivory, hides, and exotic goods. In 1000, Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland, that is Newfoundland, was almost certainly in a knarr, a ship capable of handling in the open Atlantic and carrying bulky provisions and any trade acquisitions, think of timber and grapes as the legend holds, back to Greenland. One hallmark of knarr design was the small crew requirement. You see, a knarr might only have 6 to 8 crew members, relying mostly on sail power rather than the brute strength of the oarsmen. And this was efficient for long voyages, leaving more room for cargo and reducing the need to carry food for large numbers of rowers. In contrast, a warship required a big crew of rowers who were essentially its engine. I suppose we can use those modern terminologies. We get away with it once or twice. Well, this difference meant that a Viking chieftain planning a trading expedition could do so with a fraction of the manpower needed for a raid. A practical distinction when considering the economics of Viking ventures. So between these two ends of the spectrum, the longship and the knarr, lay many intermediate types. There were smaller coastal and fishing boats, like the ferja or ferry boat, and the fyring, a 4-oared small boat. But there were also hybrid ships too, sometimes referred to as karvi, which might carry 10 to 20 oars per side, usable for both raids and general transport. One interesting variant, though, was the byrding, mentioned in some sources, a small cargo boat, perhaps used for coastal trade or supplying larger fleets. The Vikings adapted their boat designs to particular needs: narrow, shallow draft boats for navigating the twisting rivers of Russia, broader, stable vessels for the North Sea trade, and so on. Everything was always built for purpose, whether that be war or trade. The Norse also continued to innovate. There was no one-and-done option when it came to ships. By the end of the Viking era, the 11th century, some warships began to incorporate features for even greater speed under sail, such as lowering the weight aloft. The Bayeux Tapestry famously depicts a Norman longship with striped sails and animal head prows, direct descendants of the Viking longboat, carrying William the Conqueror's invasion force, a reminder that the ship technology did not vanish with the Viking Age, but rather evolved into medieval navies. Well, Viking maritime culture certainly produced a diverse fleet. No one can argue that. Each type played a role in the Norse expansion. The longboat, in a narrow sense, was the raider's razor, meant to strike fast and hard, and the knarr was the settler's and trader's wagon, built to endure long hauls and heavy loads. But both of these ships were the expressions of the same underlying nautical genius, just calibrated for different priorities. And together they enabled the multifaceted nature of the Viking enterprise. Not only swift raids and daring battles, but also long-distance trade networks, and the founding of new communities across the sea. But let's talk more in particular about raiding and war. From the Loire to Lindisfarne, the Mediterranean to the Volga, the appearance of a Viking longship, or even more of them, often heralded sudden violence and upheaval. In warfare, the longboat gave the Norse a strategic and tactical edge that left contemporaries panically scrambling to adapt. Medieval chroniclers, often on the receiving end of Viking attacks, remark frequently on the speed, mobility, and surprise afforded by these ships, with a mix of admiration and terror. The Frankish scholar Ermentarius, describing a Viking raid, lamented how the Northmen's ships could penetrate every river like serpents and strike deep inland where no enemy had been seen before. The historical record is replete with such accounts, which when analyzed shows how revolutionary the Viking use of longboats really was in an era when most European powers had, well, minimal naval capabilities. War was about fighting on land in those days. Here's a case in point. The raid on Paris in 845. In the Annals of Saint Bertin, recorded in March of that year, quote, 120 ships of the Northmen sailed up the Seine to Paris, laying waste everything on either side. The West Frankish king, Charles the Bold, hastily mustered forces, but realized he could not easily catch or defeat these river-borne raiders. In the end, he paid them off with a heavy ransom. 7,000 pounds of silver, by the way. That's pretty damn heavy. But it did make them go away. Well, this illustrates how Viking longships in war functioned like a fast-moving attack craft, able to exploit waterways as highways into the heart of enemy territories, bypassing all of those beach outposts. The same annals mention that elsewhere, a Viking fleet of 600 ships attacked along the Elbe, likely an exaggeration in number, but clearly reflecting a multiple squadron force operating simultaneously. Terrifying prospect of the time. Even if it's only 100 ships, still not good. But what made them so effective in war? It was all about the speed and shallow draft. A Viking longship under a skilled crew could average 5 to 10 knots under oar, and perhaps 10 to 15 under sail with a good wind. Enemy coast guards or militias rarely had any time to make an effective response before the Vikings had landed, plundered, and departed. The show was all over by the time they had their mail on. These ships could navigate shallow estuaries and rivers that were impassable to larger ships or to cavalry by land. In England, Vikings famously sailed up the Ouse, the Trent, and the Thames, parking their ships near towns and monasteries that thought themselves to be well and truly safe so far away from the coast. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entry for the year 866 describes a great heathen army of Danes landing from a fleet in East Anglia, then proceeding overland to capture York in the next year, 867. The Chronicle doesn't detail the ships, but earlier it notes the shock of the first incursions in 1789. The first 3 ships of the Northmen arrived and killed the local reeve, as mentioned before. Well, by the late 9th century, Vikings were arriving with scores of ships, essentially a sea-borne army. Tactically, Vikings often chose moments of chaos, bad weather, religious feast days. Those were their times to strike, when people would least expect it, or on the feast days where people were just really drunk. And these were their time to strike, leveraging the all-terrain capability of their vessels. The longbows could be dragged into hiding up narrow creeks, or even across land to adjacent waterways, confounding pursuers. Frankish sources described Vikings hauling ships up on the riverbanks to form temporary fortified camps by arranging ships and digging ditches. The ships themselves could serve as fortifications in a pinch, turned on their side or propped as a barrier. They shielded the camps, kind of like circling the wagons in the old Gallic tradition. In set-piece battles at sea, Viking longboats allowed for highly mobile engagements. Battles often resembled land combat once the ships had closed in. Warriors threw grapnels to bind ships together and fought with swords, axes, and spears, and arrows, of course, when they were at close quarters too. And a vivid example of that is the Battle of Svolder, around the year 1000, described in multiple sagas. King Olav Tryggvason of Norway, sailing with only 11 ships, including his aforementioned Long Serpent, was ambushed by a coalition of Danish and Swedish Vikings with perhaps 70 ships. But rather than flee, Olaf formed his ships in a tight defensive ring. The sagas recount how the enemy boarded the outer ships one by one. Olaf's men fiercely defended the Long Serpent. Its high sides made boarding difficult, and its crew were picked warriors. But sheer numbers overwhelmed them. Olaf, facing capture, had no choice but to leap overboard, and he was never seen again. Though a saga account, this tale shows the features of a Viking naval warfare situation: the use of shield walls on decks, the binding of ships into larger platforms, and the value of a superior ship in battle, i.e., Olaf's Long Serpent held off many lesser ships for a long time. But it also shows that Vikings did not shy away from naval combat. They didn't have any castles or secure bases when on the move, so to survive they had to fight well at sea, as well as on land. Longboats also enabled the raiding lifestyle logistically. They could carry not just warriors, but also horses for cavalry raids inland. There are accounts, too, in the Frankish chronicles, for example, of Vikings bringing horses across the sea, something only possible because the ships could be beached and the animals offloaded. In 865, the great heathen army in England likely brought horses or acquired them soon after landing, facilitating rapid movement across England. A combined arms approach made possible by ship transport. The shallow draft meant that if threatened, Vikings could quickly re-embark and push off into water too shallow for enemy ships or too distant for arrows, and as a result defending armies found themselves perpetually frustrated. You see, if they marched to meet the invaders, the Viking ships could slip away by sea. But if they stayed put, the Vikings could strike elsewhere. A rock and a hard place. And then there's the psychological aspect. That image of the dragon-prowed longship striking fear. Some chronicles speak of the dragon ships appearing suddenly out of nowhere, and Vikings sometimes exaggerated this effect by mounting carved heads on the prows, though interestingly, Norse custom and Icelandic law dictated that when returning home, they must remove the fearsome ornaments, quote, lest the land spirits be frightened. This legal tidbit shows that Vikings understood the psychological warfare aspect of their ships. The same dragon prow, meant to terrify enemies, could offend the spirits of one's own land if it wasn't covered up. Now, that's a revealing glimpse of how they really took the aura of their vessels quite seriously. But it has to be said, we shouldn't romanticize Viking raiders. These were not heroic in any real sense of the word. Their incursions brought much suffering. From a military history standpoint, the longboat was a revolutionary force multiplier. With relatively small numbers, Viking bands could strike almost anywhere along coasts and navigable rivers. The Frankish Emperor Charlemagne and his successors, despite commanding vast realms, struggled to counter this. Eventually, the Franks started building bridge forts on rivers and a few coastal defences, and the English kings created a navy of their own. King Alfred actually built a fleet of longship-like vessels to patrol against the Danes. These were direct responses to the Viking threat, and of course a tacit acknowledgement that without similar ships, one was just fighting a losing battle. And here's a pretty illustrative anecdote that comes from the annals of St. Bertin again, in 859. Viking raiders sailed up the Rhone in Francia, even dragging ships past perilous stretches. And one group portaged ships from the Loire River to the Vistula in Poland, effectively conducting an amphibious invasion across Europe's watershed. The ability to appear in such unexpected places earned some Vikings nicknames like the Grey Viking, because they were said to strike like wolves out of the mist. In Eastern Europe, Swedish Norsemen, also known as Varangians, used longboats to create riverine trade empires, establish fortified bases like Kiev, which began as a Viking stronghold controlling the Dnieper River trade. It was here that the longboats were not just instruments of raiding, but also power projection to dominate trade routes between the Baltic and Byzantine Empire. The military versatility of the longboat shone on the east as well. Byzantine sources note the Rus attacking Constantinople in 941 with a fleet of what they called monoxyla, just their word for longboats. And though their attack failed, the emperor subsequently recruited Norse warriors as his Varangian guard, valuing their maritime skill among other qualities. But of course, while the Viking longboat is often remembered for war, and I suppose the Vikings in general, it was equally the vehicle of discovery, cultural exchange, and commerce too. The same oceans that carried those axe-wielding raiders also carried enterprising traders and brave explorers to those new lands. And it's within this arena that the more capricious Viking ships, the knarrs and trade vessels, take center stage. These ships enabled those far-flung trade networks of the Viking Age, linking disparate worlds from the Arctic Circle to the Middle East. And they also allowed the Norse to become the first Europeans to reach North America, centuries before Columbus. In trading missions, Vikings loaded their ships with goods that were abundant in their homelands, or newly acquired through raids, and sailed to foreign ports to barter. Walrus ivory, furs, whale oil, woolen cloth, fine swords, just a few of the goods that they carried out. And in return they brought back silver, often in coin form or ingots, along with spices, glassware, wine, and other luxuries from the south. A remarkable account from 921 comes from an Arab diplomat by the name of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who met Viking raiders on the Volga River. He describes them as keen traders in slaves and furs, and notes their willingness to travel great distances for profit. These Rus, as they were called, traveled by river systems in longboats, showing how Viking trade routes penetrated deep into Eastern Europe. They could sail from the Baltic Sea upriver, then portage or navigate through the river networks to reach the Black or Caspian Seas, connecting to the Islamic caliphates and the Byzantine Empire. The Volga trade route saw Norse traders exchanging northern goods for Arabic silver, and that's evidenced by the tens of thousands of Arab coins, also called dirhams, by the way, found in Scandinavian hoards, certainly a testament and evidence of active commerce. Seagoing merchants, especially from Denmark and Norway, focused on the west and south. Viking merchants became common sights in the markets of Frisia and Francia, being the Low Countries, and Francia being France and Germany. while they sometimes enjoyed peaceful trade even when other bands were raiding. There is evidence, too, that Vikings founded or developed trade emporia, such as Dublin in Ireland and York in England. And these places initially were raiding bases, of course, but as soon as they go into bustling towns where commerce flourished under Viking rule. Well, the ships that facilitated this were stout knarrs that could carry bulk goods. For example, the Kaupang market in Norway and Birka in Sweden. They were both trading hubs where ships arrived with loads of luxury items, like wine and pottery from the continent, and then departed with cargoes of Arctic pelts and Scandinavian amber. But perhaps the most ambitious trading and exploratory voyages were those that went westward into the Atlantic. In the late 9th century, Norwegian Vikings began seeking new lands, driven by a mix of ambition, overpopulation, and a bit of exile, too. Some chieftains were actually fleeing the unification efforts of King Harald Fairhair. Not everybody was keen on having a big, happy family, I suppose. Using their ocean-going ships, they discovered and settled Iceland, traditionally in the 870s. And from Iceland, they sighted the barren coast of Greenland. And by the 980s, Eric the Red had led colonists to settle Greenland's fjords. These were extraordinary voyages, too, crossing 1,500 miles of open ocean, and not very calm ocean at that. But they succeeded, because the Viking ships were built for the task. The Greenland voyages were largely one-way trips with loaded ships. They carried colonists, livestock, timber, grain, everything you'd need to start a farm in an unknown land. The sagas say that 14 ships set out on one early Greenland expedition, though only 11 arrived. That indicates the bit of peril involved in the task. Yet once established, Greenland remained tied to the wider world by these ships. Knarrs would sail roughly every few years back to Iceland or directly to Norway, exporting walrus ivory, seal skins and polar bear hides from Greenland, which, by the way, at that time they were highly valued in medieval Europe, a real luxury product. And with kind of a end of the world kind of thing, the being so far away. You couldn't just get them from anywhere. It was certainly the ends of the earth. But it was likely on one of these trade routes that North America was first encountered. According to the Greenlander's saga and Eric the Red's saga, around the year 1000, Leif Erikson sailed west from Greenland and landed in a place named Vinland, likely Newfoundland or Labrador. He traveled on a knarr or similar vessel, described as large and sturdy. The sagas recount that earlier, another mariner, Bjarni Herjolfsson, had sighted unknown lands to the west when blown off course. A rather interesting surprise discovery. Leif's voyage was deliberate exploration. His ship found regions he called Helluland, that is, flat rock land. It's possibly modern-day Baffin Island. Look that up on Google Maps. It's quite out there. Also Markland, which is forest land, likely Labrador, and Vinland, or the land of wine, somewhere on the northeast American coast with a more temperate climate. While these sagas mix fact with legend, archaeological proof of a Viking presence in North America was found at Lancey Meadows in Newfoundland, a temporary camp or settlement dating to around 1000, when Norse-style buildings and artifacts had been excavated en masse. It bears a silent witness to Viking longboat voyages across the Atlantic well before any other Europeans. The ships that achieved this were not war longships, but solid ocean traders. They carried fewer crew and more supplies for survival on such a risky adventure. Maybe most of them thought they were never going to return, or even make it. I suppose it's astonishing to imagine a single-masted open ship, perhaps only 20 meters long, with a handful of Norse sailors scanning the horizon for new continents. But that's just what they did. Back in those days, the spirit of adventure outweighed the fear of death. But we could put it that way. But even in more regional exploration, Viking longboats played a key role. Norwegian Vikings explored the White Sea and the Arctic coast of Russia. One named Othere, or Ottar, visited the court of King Alfred in England around 890, and told of sailing north beyond Norway to hunt walrus and trade with Finns. Alfred's scribes recorded Othere's account, one of the earliest geographical descriptions of the Arctic, made possible by Othere's robust ship that took him beyond the North Cape. The Vikings also settled in the Faroe Islands and ventured to Shetland and Orkney. Settlements in those islands were established around the 8th and 9th centuries, also quite early. Their ships also allowed entire families to relocate. The Book of Settlements of Iceland lists 300 to 400 settler vessels coming to Iceland over several decades, each laden with goods and passengers looking for a new home. But on the flip side, Viking longboats in trade meant cultural exchange. Vikings brought back not only material wealth, but also ideas and technologies. The presence of Arab coins in Scandinavia, Byzantine silks in Viking graves, or Frankish glassware in remote Norwegian farms indicates an interconnected world. The longboat was the physical means of that connection. In bustling trade ports like Hedeby in Denmark or Novgorod in Russia, you could find a diverse mix of people: Slavs, Frisians, Arabs, Norsemen, all enabled by seafaring trade. The Vikings often acted as middlemen, for instance, carrying silk and spices obtained by the Russians downriver, trade up to the Scandinavian regions, or moving furs and amber west into Europe. An interesting anecdote in trade is this: the Volga Vikings were known for selling slaves too, captured in Eastern Europe and sold off to the Islamic Caliphate. Ibn Fadlan, while horrified by some Viking customs, described their brisk trade. They would bring boatloads of slaves and pelts, exchanging them for silver dirhams and fine fabrics, and then return north. This human and economic movement would have been impossible without reliable ships. Likewise, in the West, Vikings who settled in Normandy from 911 onwards eventually integrated into Frankish society and even embraced Christianity. Yet they maintained their maritime connections. The Norman conquerors of 1066 had Viking ancestors, and they used many derived vessels to cross the channel. We see that in the Bayeux Tapestry, of course. And thus we can see that the Viking longboat was a bridge between worlds. In exploration, it took the Norse to lands unimagined by their contemporaries. In trade, it carried goods and cultural influence across continents, and importantly, these peaceful or enterprising uses of ships were two sides of the same coin with raiding. Often the very same ship that traded could raid if the opportunity or necessity dictated. The versatility of the longboat made the Viking expansion a mosaic of activities. Some voyages were purely predatory, others purely mercantile, and many likely a mix of both. A crew might trade at one port and take a little detour and sack another on the way home. I mean, you're already there. May as well not waste the trip. The archaeological finds of cargo ships like Skolderlev I and others give us concrete evidence of ships used for commerce. For example, Skoldev I's construction, heavy pine planks, a broader form, shows a vessel built to endure the North Atlantic's fury with a full load. And it's no accident that such a ship was found scuttled in Denmark. It had done its duty, ended its life, flagging a defensive blockade in a channel. The Danes, by the way, sunk several old ships to block a waterway in the 11th century, which is why we have these Skalderlev wrecks. Let's take a look at a different kind of approach. In the Norse mythic cosmos, ships were not only practical vessels, but they were deeply symbolic and at sometimes even sacred objects. One of the most famous mythical ships is the Skidbladnir, often described in the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson. Skidbladnir was said to have been the best ship ever made. Crafted by dwarfs, nonetheless, for the god Freyr. And it had magical properties too. It always had a favorable wind whenever the sail was hoisted, and astonishingly, it could be, quote, folded up like a cloth and put into one's pocket when not needed. Now that's handy, isn't it? This detail conveys the idea of a perfect, portable ship, and pretty interesting to see the Viking imagination. Of course, it's clearly a myth. Well, I suppose you can't prove them wrong, but we're going to err on the side of reality and say that it probably does not exist. But it does reflect how much the Norse culture valued a ship which could be taken anywhere and deployed at will, that ultimate symbol of freedom and movement. The Prose Edda explains that Skidbladnir was large enough to carry all the gods fully armed, yet through magic craftsmanship completely collapsible. In mythic terms, the ship represents both the pinnacle of craft and the limitless accessibility of the world via a good ship. And it's pretty telling that such a super ship is given to Freyr, a god associated with fertility and prosperity. Ships were seen as bringers of prosperity, you see, and necessities for a fruitful life in Norse society. And then we have another prominent mythic ship, Naglfar. Far from benevolent, Naglfar is described in the poetic Edda, and Snorri's other work as called Gylfaginning. I think I'm pronouncing that right. You'll have to excuse me with some of the Norse pronunciations. Well, it's presented in this poetic Edda of Snorri as the vessel that will carry the forces of chaos at Ragnarok, that being the end of the world. And what a gruesome vessel indeed. Naglfar is made entirely from the nails of dead men. What a concept. This mythology warns that whenever someone dies with untrimmed nails, those nails add to the ship's construction, so quite morbidly people were to keep their nails trimmed to slow Naglfar's completion. At Ragnarok, Naglfar will break loose from its moorings. We have a passage from the saga of Snorri. Naglfar is loosed, says Voluspa. The ship fares from the east and Loki steers out of Muspel, the realm of fire giants, come hosts over the sea. Snorri adds that a giant named Hrym will pilot it, and it will carry the giants into battle against the gods. Now, this terrifying image of a ship of the dead emphasizes the ship's role of a conveyor of souls or forces to the other world. It's as if the ultimate threat comes by sea. And that's intriguing, that Naglfar is called the largest of all ships in myth. Even the cosmos envisions the mightiest ship for the final conflict. The ship's composition, dead men's nails, also hints at the conception of the ship as made of humanity itself, a kind of collective vessel of doom. To the Norse, who routinely sent their dead out to sea, either in ship burials or burning boats, as we'll discuss, Naglfar is a dark inversion, a ship born of death, delivering destruction. It underscores it in Norse thought. Ships could symbolize the journey to destruction or ferrying of the damned souls, not unlike the fairy in Greek myth, one of Charon, but on a bit more of an epic scale. And of course, I always think of the band Naglfar whenever I hear that. Maybe you want to look them up, or maybe you don't. It depends on your personal taste. Well, mythology also, of course, had, no surprise, seafaring gods. The god Njord, father of Freya, was a deity of the sea and wealth, often invoked by seafarers for safe passages. While no specific magical ship is ascribed to Njord in surviving myths, his patronage of sailors shows a divinity linked to ships. The goddess Ran was said to catch drowned sailors in her net, a somber reflection of how those lost at sea were thought to be claimed by the sea's deity. And in a different vein, the heroic legends sometimes have magic ships that can sail on land or need no crew. For example, in Gongu Hrolf's saga, a hero receives a ship that sails itself wherever commanded. These tales, fanciful as they are, again project that ideal of a perfect ship. But moving from myth to ritual, the archaeological record in Scandinavia reveals the practice of ship burials. High-status individuals, chieftains, kings, and in one notable case, 2 women of evidently great importance, were interred on actual ships and buried under earth mounds. The famous excavations at Osberg and Gokstad ships in Norway, as well as the Sutton Hoo ship burial in England, as in East Anglia, 7th century, likely related to Norse or related to Germanic customs. All attest to this. We've seen them plenty of times. In the Osberg burial, 834 AD, a richly ornamented ship was pulled ashore and used as a burial chamber for 2 women, along with an astounding array of grave goods, fine tapestries, sledges, a cart, animal sacrifices, that is, horses and dogs, personal items, and more. And in fact, the ship was 21 meters long and quite well decorated. Clearly not a mundane vessel, but perhaps one used ceremonially. Some argued that the Osberg ship, by the way, being somewhat less robust, might have been a royal yacht for more calm waters. The intention was likely symbolic, to provide the deceased with a means of transportation to the afterlife. As the saying goes, a Viking needs a ship, even in death. The graves were often oriented toward water. The concept might be that the dead would sail to the land of the dead, for example, the Hall of Odin or the realms beyond the horizon. In Baldur's funeral in Norse myth, the gods placed the dead god Baldur on his ship and set it aflame and adrift, a scene mirrored in literary accounts like the Old English poem Beowulf, where a king is given a send-off on a burning ship at sea. But such send-offs were rarely done in reality. Burning ship burials would leave little trace, which might explain their rarity in archaeology. But at least one eyewitness account exists of something similar. Ahmad ibn Fatlan's description of a Rus chieftain's cremation on the Volga in 922. He provides a detailed and rather harrowing account of a Viking Rus funeral among the Volga Bulgars. He notes that first, if the deceased was poor, they would make a little boat, which they would lay him in and burn. But if he was rich or noble, a whole ship was used. In the observed funeral, the dead chieftain's body was placed on his riverboat, which was hauled onto shore. Over 10 days, they prepared a great funeral with rituals, including the sacrifice of animals and ultimately a slave girl who volunteered to join her master in death. The ship was made into a pyre. They placed the body in a wooden pavilion on deck with treasures, weapons, slaughtered animals, and finally, the girl, who was ritually killed and laid by her master and then the ship was set on fire. According to Ibn Fahlan, thereupon the flames engulfed the wood, then the ship, the pavilion, the man, the girl, and everything in the ship. In a short time, they were all turned to ashes. Ibn Fahlan's astonished narrative confirms that the burning ship ritual was not just a legend, but an actual practice. Well, at least among the Swedish roots in the East. But he also observed the belief behind it. The ruse told him that the fire would carry the dead to paradise, and that ship would serve as a vehicle for the journey. The use of a ship in a funerary context, whether buried whole or burnt, shows a spiritual metaphor, that death itself was seen as just another voyage. The deceased sets sail from the world of the living. Well, ships also appear in ritual landscapes in Scandinavia. Archaeologists have found stone ship settings, arrangements of standing stones outlining the shape of a ship, often at grave sites from the Bronze and Iron Ages, so we're going quite far back with this. The stone ships likely symbolize the same notion, the grave as a ship for the soul's final voyage. And though not actual boats, they show how ingrained the ship's symbol was in funerary iconography. On a simpler level, many Viking graves, even without ship burials, included a boat or part of one, sometimes just a few planks or a boat keel, perhaps to invoke the same context. And Norse mythology even envisions the sky itself as a great ship, carrying the sun. In some Bronze Age rock carvings, solar symbols are on ships, while by Viking times the cosmology had shifted to personified sun and moon riding in chariots. The older idea of a solar bark, akin to Egyptians' Ra boat, is found on stone carvings in Scandinavia, hinting at quite a long tradition of seeing ships as cosmic vessels. But we should also mention the removal of dragon heads here again, now in a more ritual context. The earliest Icelandic law code opens by saying no one should land a ship with a dragon head attached, and if they have such a proud decoration at sea, they must take it down before approaching land, lest the land spirits be frightened. Quite fascinating, isn't it? It does imply that the Vikings recognized local spirits, and thought the fierce visage of their warships could scare or offend those entities. Therefore, a religious ritual observance, they removed their heads as a sign of respect. This shows that even the appearance of a ship had a more spiritual dimension. The war prow was like a mask of terror for enemy ships. Of course, you would have to take that mask off in friendly territory. The law, dated traditionally to 930 AD in Iceland, codifies what was likely a wider custom in Scandinavia. It also subtly acknowledges that ships carried spiritual power, enough to necessitate regulation in law. Finally, ships figured in Norse festivals and ceremonies. There is some evidence that miniature ships could be used as votive offerings to the gods too. The Vikings also erected rune stones that mention voyagers, and a few depict ships. One famous rune stone from Sweden, the Rook stone, possibly mentions a great longship among its inscrutable poetic inscriptions. In essence, Viking longboats carried immense symbolic weight. In myth, they were owned by the gods, and carried the forces of chaos, or perhaps salvation. And in ritual, they escorted the dead to the afterlife, and formed part of sacred lore and custom. The sea, the ship, and the journey, they are a recurring triad in the Norse spiritual conception. The longboat was not just a physical craft, but a metaphysical symbol of safe passage, transition, and maybe ventures into the unknown, whether that be this world or the next. A Viking might call his coffin a last ship, or see his life as a voyage across waters under the protection of divine powers like Njord or Aegir, a sea giant who hosted the gods in his hall far beneath the ocean. And we find ourselves at the end of today's talk. Didn't we have fun? I had fun. I hope you did. I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters now. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitimus, Gary, Charlene, Linda Rees, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine. Oh, I've lost my spot. There I am. Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Towery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftus, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Vanita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, and Yvette. Thank you so much. I hope you had fun today. I hope you learned a lot about the Vikings as well, and their boats. Not all just about raiding and war. Quite a sophisticated society. All right, everyone. Good night, lots of love to you all, and farewell for now. I'll see you when you feel like returning. I hope that's soon.